Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Rousseau, and I'll be your moderator for today's presentation. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, New Rules for Selling Retirement Products and Services in the United States, What It Means for Meetings and Incentives, presented by FICP CEO Steve Bova and Site CEO Kevin Hinton. Today's webinar is about to begin, but first a couple of go-to tips. Please note that all audience members are muted. This assures high audio quality and clarity for our speakers. We encourage feedback and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. You can submit questions at any time by simply typing into the question and answer box on your toolbar. This is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. As time permits, we will answer questions from the audience at the end of today's program. We will try and address all your questions, but if you happen to have a question after the webinar is finished, feel free to contact Site at education@siteglobal.com or FICP at info@ficpnet.com after today's webinar. And now I'd like to hand it over and welcome our presenters, Steve and Kevin. Welcome, Steve and Kevin.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Steve, thank you for taking the time to spend this important time with us to talk about this new ruling from the U.S. Department of Labor.
Thank you.
Before we get started, wanted to just acknowledge that this webinar is taking place on the first ever Global Meetings Industry Day. Hopefully everybody on the line has heard about this. This is an event that is really celebrating the great value of face-to-face meetings, the personal connections, the business outcome, the economic impact that occurs through face-to-face meetings, incentives, and business events. And the Global Meetings Industry Day is a celebration, a global celebration with nearly 100 events happening worldwide, really to call attention to the value and the importance of face-to-face events. You might be aware that an anthem was created. I think both of our organizations were involved in the creation of a GMID anthem. And if you haven't seen this, check it out. There's a great YouTube video that shows the great diversity of the different types of events that are part of our global industry. And you can see the link on the screen there. It's a song whose lyrics really are about the importance of face-to-face events. You can also get more information about Global Meetings Industry Day at the meetingsmeanbusiness.com website. And if you are on social media at all, you've probably seen a lot of activity already around GMID.
Sure.
So, Steve, shall we get started?
Let's go.
Okay. So, really the purpose of this webinar is for us to discuss what both of our associations are hearing about this newly imposed U.S. Department of Labor ruling and what actions might be taken individually and collectively to address this kind of new reality for our industry. And Steve, I'll get to a question for you in a moment to help us frame things up, but I just want to let our audience members know that we're not here to provide advice or any technical interpretations of the ruling itself. However, what we are prepared to do is address its potential implications as they relate to our members, meeting professionals, the incentive industry, and really others within the hospitality and others in the business of events. So why don't we just start with kind of the basics, Steve, and really if you can just frame up what's this issue kind of all about, and if you can just kind of summarize. I mean, it was a 150-page document or something, but if you can provide us a summary, that would be a great start.
Well, sure, Kevin. A week ago Wednesday, Department of Labor Secretary Tom Perez unveiled a ruling that will require financial advisors, consultants, brokers, and agents to act in their client's best financial interest and not in their own when offering retirement investment advice. They will be required to disclose any conflicts of interests and to be transparent regarding how they are compensated. This has not been a requirement until now.
Okay.
The Department of Labor estimates, and this is their perspective on it, I sat in on the actual announcement, that conflicts of interest in retirement advice cost Americans about $17 billion a year. That's the big wow factor that they're coming across with, and perhaps the emotional appeal to the general public audience. That's the crux of the issue that is being emphasized by them. But many of us on the call today, and those of us in the industry, see that there are other elements to the story.
And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, really about whether or not this is a direct criticism of our industry, or if we're more kind of collateral damage and part of kind of the unintended consequences, or maybe partially intended consequences. But let's first talk about who the Department of Labor is trying to protect. They're clearly have been preparing for this and are advocating for American consumers. Can you tell me a little bit more about who they're really trying to protect with this?
They're trying to protect us, the general population. Those of us who are in the American workforce. This is an American ruling, but we'll get to it in a minute, that it's impacting other parts of the world. But it affects the American workforce for new and better jobs and ensuring the adequacy of Americans' workplace. It's really kind of why the DOL exists. The ruling itself sets out to protect the common or novice investor, people like us that, before our parents might have received pensions. When this all started about 25, 35 years ago, we started investing in 401ks and so forth, and we were more self-directed. And that's what this is about, is making sure that we are taking advantage of the opportunity to invest for our careers, our retirements.
Okay, great. So there's, within the standards itself, or within the ruling, there's a differentiation between fiduciary standard and suitability standard that's been clarified in this ruling. Steve, we put it on the screen for our audience to be able to see this, but can you talk a little bit about what this means for financial advisors?
Sure. On the financial side, the ruling applies only to those who provide investment advice for retirement accounts. Those including employer-sponsored retirement programs like 401ks, individual retirement accounts, IRAs, and also many health savings accounts. Financial advisors will be subject to the fiduciary standard that you see on the screen that requires them to put the client's interest first. That's what this is all about. Rather than what was happening, the looser accountability, the suitability standard that simply requires that an advisor, and I'm going to just read the quote, act on a reasonable basis to believe that a recommended transaction or investment strategy involving a security or securities is suitable for the customer based on the information obtained through reasonable diligence. So the biggest difference being a fiduciary is that you are now acting in your client's best interests.
Okay, so in those terms, I think I understand it, but I still think that it would be helpful maybe to put that more into kind of plain English, Steve. Fiduciary and suitability, these are words that seem like they're part of, an official statement or an official, ruling. Can you just kind of put it in plain English for us to help us understand what that really means?
So the bottom line is this: if you are an advisor, consultant, broker, or agent, and are compensated even partly from commissions from investments that you sell, you're probably not acting as a fiduciary. What's important to note is this rule is not much of a change for advisors who already hold themselves to the fiduciary standard. And it will probably not have a very big effect on their business model, but it could lead to some compliance and paperwork changes. However, the rule will be disruptive to advisors whose business model depends on fees and commissions. That's what this is after. We anticipate that small business advisors perhaps might be more impacted than those who work with larger companies who have greater resources and sell various other products.
Gotcha. Okay. So we cited an event recently, and we had a couple folks from our membership talk about what they're seeing with their clients, and then we're going to talk a little bit more later about that. But they were differentiating between how incentive programs are funded, and I think that's what you're talking about here. Is there's a greater change with regard to certain programs depending on where the funding comes from for those particular programs.
That is correct.
Okay. So for some of us, we may have just heard about this maybe when FICP and CITE did our joint announcement a couple weeks ago, or maybe with all the kind of hoopla that was celebrated last week when this was formally announced. But this has been in the works for a while. Steve, can you just kind of take us back to the beginning, where this started, maybe a little bit of historical context on how we got to where we are?
The Department of Labor first issued a proposal in 2010. Since then, nothing really came of that proposal. But since then, other countries, including the UK, Australia, particularly, have implemented rules outlawing commissions and requiring more transparency. And the rules there apply to all advisors, not just those selling retirement funds, retirement plans. We also hear that changes are underway in Canada. I don't have a lot of specific information about this, but I think the point is that this is happening around the world in various ways, and perhaps even deeper than just focusing on retirement. I have to say that we saw this coming since it started in 2010. And it might be logical to assume that this might be the start of more, but I don't want to forecast. What really happened when it really became on our radar was that the second proposal was issued in April of 2015 by Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Massachusetts Democrat, who issued this report called "Villas, Castles, and Vacations: How Perks and Giveaways Create Conflicts of Interest in the Annuity Industry." That's what really caught our attention when that came out. And it really seemed like an attack on our industry.
Yeah, I would say from the sounds of that report that it is an indictment of the good work that we're doing in the meeting and incentive business. But I also feel like it's different than 2008 and 2009 when we truly were an industry under attack.
It's much different. This came out, and I think it just not only caught everybody's interest, but it became the reality that they were moving forward on this. This wasn't a question of when or what, it's when. And following what happened when it all came out, organizations really directly related to the financial and insurance industry started to get involved. And the process is that before a ruling is unveiled, that there's a comment period. And in this case, it was last July. It was a 5-month comment period. They held 4 days of public hearings and received over 3,000 comments from various either individuals or organizations. There were over 100 meetings held. So the Department of Labor was receiving feedback from a variety of different sources. Several organizations that we're involved with were also included, like LIMRA, that's representing the insurance side of things, or with CITE and FICP, the Meetings Mean Business Coalition. So our organizations have been represented all along.
Sure. I've also seen and read that other trade groups such as the American Banking Association and other associations that directly represent professionals and companies in the financial services industry, they do feel like this is a game-changing rule change for their industry, and they're also actively engaged in this process. And most of those comments really came from the industry itself. I mean, we have been actively participating, but they were much more active earlier on in this process.
Yes, they're more directly impacted, correct?
You were telling me that one of your members was really the first person to mention this to you sometime last year.
So yes, last July, I learned about this through an email from one of our loyal, passionate, and concerned hospitality partners.
Sure.
Her name is Sherry Wallach. Sherry forwarded some information that members were forwarding on to her, and at the time I found largely that many FICP members were unaware of the ruling and its potential impact on their companies, and for those in the incentive travel industry. So, not being a lobbying organization, we represent members and try to help them in their careers. But when we find out that our members and their companies and perhaps their livelihoods are being challenged, of course, we're going to get involved.
Sure.
So I saw this and immediately acted.
And it's one of the reasons why we have chosen this platform of Global Meetings Industry Day to hold this webinar, right? Because we see this as an opportunity for FICP and SITE to continue to collaborate. Again, we may not be able to change the ruling, although we're going to try if we see that it's having an adverse effect. But most importantly, we want people to be aware of these changes and then help them with getting informed and figuring out what they can do kind of in this new reality.
Exactly, Kevin. I think that's really the point for those on the call who are involved in it as meeting professionals, is when things like this happen, it creates opportunities, and the opportunity is to become more educated on how this is impacting not only your company, but what you do every day. And perhaps it's also an opportunity to get involved in the conversations within your company so that you can provide insight and value to the conversations that are going on.
Fantastic. I think that's great advice for all of us. And I know that on behalf of Steve and myself, for all those in the audience, that you have our commitment to continue to work in conjunction with the Meetings Mean Business team, who's also staying very closely involved with the Department of Labor, has been engaged with them in conversation throughout this process. We will continue to stay on top of this and do everything we can to help support our members in this industry. Why don't we shift just for a little bit and get back into some technical language, Steve? This was a ruling, which is different than a law or say legislation that has been passed by the U.S. Congress. And we've got some definitions on the screen here to help people. But Steve, tell us a little bit about what this means, or do we not have to do it? Do we not have to abide? Tell us a little bit more about what this means.
Sure. So the reason we're addressing this is we've received some questions as to what is a ruling and how does it happen. So not being a government relations expert myself, I relied on what many of us do. I Googled stuff. And so just for the benefit of the audience, just to see the difference between rulings, regulations, and laws. And, rules, we have rules as parents, or we have rules in our organizations. But a ruling from the perspective of like the Department of Labor is that they are an authoritative body that is empowered to make decisions, decrees, or statements, pronouncements, or whatever they may be, and they're empowered by the government to do so. Whereas a regulation, the difference is very subtle in a way, but with a regulation, it's still a rule, but it's approved by the public. And it goes through more of a governmental process, and the consequences are perhaps more specifically spelled out. Mm-hmm. And now laws, I'm not going to go into detail about laws, we know that, but that's the probably the most technical piece of it. This is not a law. Okay. This is a ruling.
But it is binding.
It is binding, and the DOL had the authority to do this without requiring a vote or passage from the public. That's why we saw this coming. We knew it was inevitable, and that's why we are having this discussion, because now it's out there, time to act.
Sure. So it reminds me of over the last 10 or so years in a different industry that also had to abide by certain rules. The pharmaceutical industry, in many cases, was really kind of self-managing and self-policing, if you will, with the creation of the Pharma Code. There was the Sunshine Act that was passed, and many who plan meetings and incentives in the pharmaceutical space or the medical space know that has been a far-reaching movement that has really seen nearly universal adoption by organizations similarly here across the world as it relates to meetings, incentives, and other events that bring together pharmaceutical professionals, medical professionals, and others in similar industries for the purpose of their work. So I think that we're assuming that we'll see also universal adoption in the financial services sector. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree. It's not entirely different from what you just explained.
Okay. So let's talk about a little bit of what we see to be consequences, and in some cases unintended consequences of this new rule that we have kind of been presented with.
Sure, and this is to relate what we're hearing from some of our members and in conversations with some of the other organizations that are more directly involved representing the advisors themselves. And what we see is that the ruling itself, we understand that to make a level playing field and to increase transparency, hard to argue against that.
Sure.
But what in the spirit of while doing this, sometimes we're not aware of the unintended consequences that are also going to happen.
Right.
And what we're hearing from those is that perhaps us, the investors, might have less access to advice, or we might have fewer choices.
I thought this was supposed to protect us.
It's well, that's what I mean, an unintended consequence, right?
Okay.
So you're thinking sometimes good intentions don't always have the right results that you're looking for, and it's so new. We don't really know what's going to happen, but what we can, at least to raise our guard and to be prepared that if that's going to happen, we're ultimately see how it filters down into the meetings and events and incentives industry.
Okay.
But at the surface, especially for qualifiers, there might be higher compliance costs for companies. Certainly, they're going to have more meetings to learn about it. There's a risk that some advisors would stop selling some retirement products and limiting, like I mentioned, limiting choice to the public. But also, we're beginning to hear a little bit about how automated technology could get involved using the internet through wizards and other tools, where you can go in as a customer or as a consumer, and it would walk you through, kind of like having an online advisor. And I don't know how people feel about that, but I equate that to like searching for a car on cars.com. Do you want a red one? And do you want an SUV? Or so is that what we're going to do for retirement information? We're not retirement or financial experts, but we just wanted to at least paint a picture of what might be happening internally and how that rolls out into impacting our meetings.
Well, I certainly hope that some of these things are just initial reactions by the marketplace. So the government made its decision, and now the private sector the ball's in our court, and we'll see amongst companies in our memberships and beyond, how they decide what they're going to change or not change in how they manage their businesses as a consequence of that. So I think that's something. I know we developed an initial set of FAQs, or frequently asked questions, that we'll continue to update as we hear about what is it more specifically that companies are doing as a result of this new ruling.
Sure, and before we move on to the next, part of this, we've talked a little bit about the insurance and financial side of things, a little bit about meeting planners, but the hospitality community, those in hotels and so forth, they have a great concern to find out how is this going to impact meetings. Are there going to be fewer meetings? Are they going to be smaller? We don't know that right now, and that the companies are addressing themselves. So we're not going to try to alarm anybody as far as what to happen, because we just don't know right now. So the best thing that all of us can do is to become really good students and become more educated about what the ruling exactly says. And then each company, I know, is individually addressing how they're going to respond.
Okay. And what's the time frame for making these changes? So what's been spelled out in terms of when these rules will take effect?
Well, there's some conflicting information out there. According to the Department of Labor fact sheet, financial professionals must act as fiduciaries beginning in April 2017.
Okay.
And this is 1 year after it's published in the Federal Register. They won't have to adopt all of the required procedures until January of 2018, full compliance. That relates to what the Department of Labor has stated. However, we're hearing some things as far as it coming out up to 8 months from now, by the end of the year.
Okay.
So whatever it is, now's the time to start digging in.
Gotcha. Okay. Before we go and talk about what we're hearing from our members, one of our audience members had a question about this is a ruling or this is a law. I know when I spoke at our event a few weeks ago, I talked about it not being law because it's not. It's a ruling that was made by the U.S. Department of Labor. For all practical purposes, it's the same thing. It's just a different process. There was a slide a couple slides ago about the difference between rulings and laws. And while this is a ruling by the U.S. Department of Labor and not something that has been passed by the U.S. Congress and signed by the President as part of legislation, it essentially has the same effect. It is binding, and Steve just talked about the time frame within which companies in the financial services sector need to comply. And for those who do not comply, there will be different types of penalties, punishments, which are some to be determined. I'm sure some were, in the language of the ruling. But to clarify for the audience, although it's not legislation, it's a rule by the Department of Labor. It has essentially the same effect.
These relate to the process of how it's unveiled.
Yeah.
But you're right, Kevin. It could be challenged, just like laws could be challenged. Mm-hmm. And we don't know the extent to which it's going to be challenged. And especially this being an election year, one can only guess.
Right.
But right now, we're prepared to move forward as is. We knew it was coming out, and we knew it was coming out in April. And what I do know is that there are a lot of meetings going on with FICP members, and their companies are addressing the issue, and they're taking it very seriously.
Yeah, good. Well, let's talk about what we're hearing specifically from our members. Let's first with you, Steve. What are you hearing from FICP's members, especially over the last couple of weeks, or even since the ruling was made public last week?
Well, it's been kind of quiet. Maybe it's because they've been in a lot of meetings. But this isn't foreign to those of us in the financial and insurance world. We live in a regulated world where they have full compliance departments. So I don't think anybody is overwhelmed by this. It's just now more curious of what does it mean, and each company is going to address it in a different way based on the products that they sell. And some that don't sell these products aren't even impacted. So within my association's community, not everybody is impacted, but many are. And we just know that they're in this process of reviewing right now. And as I mentioned, our hospitality partners are equally as interested in how that might impact them. I think maybe one of the best ways would be to just summarize an email that I received yesterday from one of our members, because I think it speaks for our entire group in many ways. This person says that this is where the line exists between planners who execute only and planners who involve themselves in strategy. So the executors and the strategists, that in this case, this person has constant access to senior management and knows exactly what's going on with this issue. Highly involved, highly engaged. In fact, her company is involved in the lobbying part of it, really from the beginning, and predicts that it's going to change the scope of how their advisors can qualify for meetings on the retirement side and on the individual side. So as a consequence, the paperwork is going to increase dramatically, and they're addressing all of these issues right now. So this is one company. Right. We know this is happening in multiple companies. And what we're trying to take a look at is how is this impacting the overall
the industry. Right, sure. Right, which is admittedly early for us to say, and what we're intentionally not doing is getting into the forecasting or the predictions business about what the certainly the longer term implications. We're just expecting that there are going to be some. We just don't know exactly what they're going to be. I can tell you, hearing from site members, it varies by country and company. It's similar to what you're saying. We have, like FICP, we have a strong membership up in Canada. This is a particularly strong segment in the Canadian event industry, and there's an organization, a Canadian organization called CLIA, so different from the cruise line organization. The CLIA is, represents a lot of companies that would be part of FICP's membership, and they took a fairly aggressive stance on it, and we're encouraging many companies to halt their programs for the time being until more information is known about how this is all going to play out. Now, from an industry standpoint, we would prefer to take a different approach, which is to say, don't cancel your programs, and if you need to make adjustments, if you need to work with your hospitality partners on changes to the program, start that conversation soon. But that's been a specific response up in Canada. I know that's affecting our members, losing programs in some cases, which is really unfortunate here. We do expect that will be some of our members' experience. I'm also hearing that while this is, a U.S. Department of Labor change, you mentioned how this has been, this type of action has been taken in other countries, that there's an expectation that this will be something that will be adopted in various forms in different markets. And so while this may be kind of the front end of that this is not a U.S. Specific issue, that a number of other countries will look into this. And it is their right and their obligation to help to protect and certainly to serve citizens. So in that sense, it's understandable. So I'm hearing that our members are in conversation with their clients about the specifics of funding sources for their incentives, for example, and whether or not they have changes to make as a consequence of this. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So it does become somewhat of a case-by-case basis. Some people have said it's a wake-up call for our industry, particularly this sector, around getting much more clear on some of these issues. So I'm hearing generally, thankfully, there's not been a panic, and I think that's one of the reasons why you and I have wanted to collaborate on this, is to, as much as we can, prevent there from being a panic, a sense of being attacked. And fortunately, we haven't seen that type of behavior, and I'm hoping that that's going to continue to be the case.
Yeah, and connecting the dots really is that how people qualify for an incentive program might change,
right?
But that doesn't change the importance of having incentive programs. In fact, I think site has data that suggests that 3/4 of all companies provide incentives in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I mean, that's been part of our case, kind of our public case, if you will, that according to a study that was conducted a few years ago at the Incentive Federation, 74% of U.S. businesses, 74% invest in incentive programs. So this is not isolated, certainly not isolated to the financial services industry. So we're going to continue to be an advocate for the value of well-designed, well-executed incentive programs. We have a relatively new campaign that started last year that simply says incentive travel works, and we will continue to celebrate the good that comes out of incentive programs, such as increased loyalty to brand, increased employee engagement, overall business growth. Those are all things that nobody can argue with, are good for really any organization. So it's also been a bit of a rallying cry for us to unify, come together, so there can really be voices for reason, but also voices for, you know, why this is such a great business that we're in. Yeah, it's a livelihood, but it's also there's intrinsic value within business events and meetings and incentives.
We don't want our industry to be one of the unintended consequences.
That's right. That's right. So let's move on and just talk about other tips and advice. And we've talked about this a little bit, but Steve, what else would you suggest to our audience in terms of what they might be wise to do at this stage?
Well, don't be fearful. This is an opportunity to unite. We, you know, in the association world, associations usually benefit when things like this happen because it gives us a platform to bring members together.
Yeah.
And that under, whether you consider it a crisis, it could be an opportunity. And that's the way we see this. We see this as an opportunity for, especially for meeting professionals, to unite under their associations, gain the tools that will help them have the right conversations within their companies to demonstrate their value. For example, is it on their radar that if their incentive programs are going to be altered in any way, how does that change the footprint of their meetings? And if meeting professionals out there negotiating a contract for 2019, how might this change their meetings? I think that's really the question that's out there. So this opens the door for you to make the case to be involved in those meetings and to be viewed as a valued participant in this issue.
Yeah, it really could affect the number of qualifiers, right? I mean, it all depends on how they're designed, but I think that's I guess what I would suggest is really knowing the process and maybe being at the front end of that conversation within your companies about understanding whether you would expect that the total number of qualifiers might decrease, and so that may change things like room blocks and attrition clauses and things like that. And so that gets into kind of the nuts and bolts of contracts with hotels, and so just to be experts on your own meetings and incentive programs and how your company has written these qualification standards so that you can understand how that might affect the participant in the qualification. I think we've talked enough about meetings mean business and other organizations that we're collaborating with and what we will continue to collaborate. I know FICP and LIMRA have been in close touch on this and remain so. And I guess there's a couple closing comments that while we continue to monitor this and we see what the effects are, we will continue to stay proactive. We are expecting that there will be some adverse effects on our business, on our members' business, and it is our obligation to do what we can to help our members, particularly in times of challenge and need. But it's also important for us to say that we don't disagree with the intent of this ruling, of this change. What we are contending with and will continue to be proactive with is negative comments related to our industry, and as we looked at earlier in the webinar, is unintended consequences of rules to consumers that will ultimately affect those companies that market and sell financial and insurance products. And we know that your industry, Steve, are some of our hospitality partners' best customers. And so we want to remain united, and we mentioned earlier that SITE and FICP will continue to stay closely connected, collaborate with our friends from the Meetings Mean Business Coalition, and keep our members informed about what's happening on this topic. And we've assembled a few resources that are on this last slide. If you do want to read the Warren Report, here's where you can find it. And we're going to make this slide deck available after the webcast. so if you don't get a chance to write down that URL, but if you just Google Warren Report, you'll probably find this, and that we referenced earlier. You can learn more about the Department of Labor. The last link specifically is the 150-page ruling, which makes for really interesting reading. And then also the joint statement that FICP and CITE put together now 2 weeks ago, really as a first formal step to let our members know that this is coming and we were collaborating. And then lastly, the meetings mean business, where there are plenty of tools and resources for anybody who's interested in talking about why meetings and incentives are critical for business, critical for communities, and critical for people. And so that's just a great resource in good times and in bad. So I'll just close my comments with just anything, Steve, we didn't get a chance to talk about in the course of today's webinar.
No, I don't have anything else to add other than to thank everybody for participating and bringing our organizations together at a time that just makes sense.
That sounds great. Well, we have encouraged everyone to use this as an opportunity to get informed, and we would ask all of you to stay in touch with Steve and myself, with your board members and your associations, so that we can stay united and stay informed. But feel free to contact either of us directly with any specific questions. And other than that, we will post this webinar and make it available. And we have one question from the audience, and it says, how do you see this affecting programs that have already been contracted? In this case, the person asking has a large incentive trip in May of 2017 and qualification started in 2015. So that's a great question. That's one of those things that, the time frame is such that according to, the ruling, they take effect at the beginning of 2018. That is after your May 17 program. So I wouldn't say you don't have to worry about it, but I would become real familiar with the fine print around the time frame and that January 1, 2018 deadline. Steve, what else would you suggest in response?
So, yeah, programs in 2016 and 2017, start looking at them and maybe using them as examples of how, as your company has these conversations, how they might be potentially impacted. And then any programs from 2018 or thereafter, might be a good time to, again, bring that to the table and say, okay, we have a program that's planned here. How are these changes going to impact this program? Because I need to contact my hotels.
Sure. So that would be our best answer to that question. Thank you very much. And again, if anybody has questions that you'd like to take offline, we would welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation. But with that, we will bring the webinar to a close. Thanks, Steve, very much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for the opportunity to collaborate on this. It's been a lot of fun and just a great show of, I think, solidarity and strength for our two organizations to continue to work together on this issue, and looking forward to continuing to do that. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. Whether you are tuning in live or you weren't able to join us live and have viewed this afterwards, you can always reach Steve and I via email, or feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you at one of our events in the near future.